it's very difficult to map the trait theories directly onto the narrative and the clinical theories. Alright, so at the highest level of resolution, here's how people can differ from one another. They can be industrious or orderly, and those two aspects are quite highly intercorrelated, but sufficiently differentiable so that the differences are interesting. Industriousness and orderliness seem to predict different things. So for example, industriousness seems to be a better predictor of academic achievement than orderliness does, even though they both clump under conscientiousness. And then there's volatility and withdrawal for emotional stability, or neuroticism. It's described different ways. You're neurotic if you feel a lot of negative emotion, and you're emotionally stable if you don't. The negative emotions that are associated with neuroticism, we thought for a long time it was all negative emotions that were associated with neuroticism, but it seems to be more like pain and anxiety. And pain is somewhat equivalent to the emotion you feel if you're frustrated or disappointed or grieving, and anxiety seems to be the emotion you feel when you're subject to uncontrollable or unexpected circumstances, or when you're subject to cues of frustration, disappointment, or grief. So volatile people don't really seem to avoid because of their negative emotion, although their emotions bounce a lot, especially their negative emotions. So if you're associated with someone who's volatile, what you would observe is that they seem to overreact to things. They get more irritated than the circumstance might seem to indicate. And their emotional response to things, on the negative end, is relatively unpredictable day to day. So there's a lot of variability and a lower threshold for the experience. People who withdraw are people who appear to be stopped by their experience of negative emotion. So if they're afraid of something, they won't do it. Where the volatile person, they might do it, but they'll complain a lot while they're doing it. So we don't know a lot about the difference between volatility and withdrawal yet, because those have been recently extracted out using statistical means, and they seem stable, but exactly what they predict yet, apart from the few things that I've tentatively suggested to you, isn't yet clear. Agreeableness sounds like a positive thing. Politeness and compassion. We know that liberals are more compassionate and conservatives more polite, but we don't know a lot more about the distinction between politeness and compassion. And we don't know why conservatives are more polite and liberals are more compassionate, but we do know that that appears to be the case. We also know, by the way, that conservatives are more orderly. They're less open as well, which is the dimension we'll talk about in a moment. Those are three of the big five traits: conscientiousness, emotional stability, and agreeableness. They clump together to make a super factor called stability. And stability looks like it might be associated with higher levels of serotonin. So serotonin is a major brain neurotransmitter that seems to regulate, broadly speaking, emotion and motivation. And if your serotonin levels, so to speak, are relatively high, then you're a relatively stable person. And if your serotonin levels are low, then you tend to be impulsive and prone to negative emotion. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting about serotonin is that it tracks your position in the dominance hierarchy as well. So the higher you are up in a given dominance hierarchy, the more serotonin your brain produces, and that makes you more confident and less unstable. And the lower you are in the hierarchy, the lower your brain serotonin levels. And the reason for that seems to be that if you're low in the dominance hierarchy, well, you should be afraid, because almost anything can knock you into oblivion. Because if you're right at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, you're barely hanging on, and you just can't tolerate any more threat. And conversely, it might also be appropriate for you, if someone dangles a reward in front of you, for you to grab it, because it's not exactly clear it's going to be the next day. Whereas if you're up high in the dominance hierarchy, it's like you can take a lot of blows, and you're so well situated socially that it's probably not going to overwhelm you that much. And you don't have to be impulsive, because the microenvironment that you inhabit is very stable. So the negative emotion dimension, emotional stability, is particularly associated with serotonergic function, but we think that the whole superfactor of stability is associated with serotonergic tone. So some of this, like I mentioned already, all of these different aspects, traits, and superfactors were all derived statistically, but evidence has continued to accrue over the last 20 years with regards to the biological substrate of the traits. And so as we progress through them one by one, we'll also talk about, hypothetically, what constitutes the underlying biology.